The subject of this account is a man named Edward Sterling. He was not a prominent individual, a statesman, or a person of public renown. By all reports, he was an unremarkable man, a reserved, fastidious accountant in his early 40s employed by a moderately sized financial firm in the city center. His neighbors characterized him as civil yet distant, a person who remained private, someone with whom you might share a brief greeting in the passage, but about whom you knew almost nothing. He was a man of routine. He departed for his job at the identical time each morning and came back at the identical time each evening. His existence followed a constant, predictable cadence. But Edward possessed a hidden strength against the quiet isolation of his life. He was a strategist, a man who considered the future, and in an action that would inadvertently preserve this remarkable capsule of time, Edward had settled his rental payments for his humble one-bedroom apartment a number of years into the future. It represented a considerable amount of money, but it afforded him a sense of security. He had safeguarded his small piece of the world. Then, on a particular Tuesday during the autumn of 1983, Edward Sterling failed to appear at his job. His associates telephoned his apartment, but the line simply continued to ring. Days evolved into weeks. A report for a missing person was submitted, but with no relatives in the state and very few intimate friends to pursue the issue, his case rapidly became inactive. He was merely another countenance, another name in a metropolis of millions. And due to his rent being settled, nobody from the building's administration had cause to access his apartment. Years elapsed. The building was sold to new owners, management firms arrived and departed, and the documents for the prepaid unit were either misplaced or filed away, forgotten. Apartment 4B and its silent dweller were effectively erased by clerical error and the flow of time, a specter in the building's administrative system. Until this moment, for 37 years, Apartment 4B was a ghost. Then, in the year 2020, the building was sold yet again. The new property management firm, a contemporary company that took pride in its digital proficiency, initiated a complete audit of the building's holdings and occupants. It was a routine measure. They reviewed old financial records and converted archaic documents into digital format. It was then that they discovered the inconsistency. A unit that was registered as occupied with rent designated as paid in full through the mid-1980s, yet for which there was no current occupant file. No documentation of utility consumption for several decades. No means of contact. It was a digital phantom within their otherwise immaculate system. Perplexed, the building manager, a young man named Leo, decided to look into it. He inspected the mailbox for 4B. It was vacant and tidy, but the lock resisted, as though it had not been used in a great while. He ascended to the 4th floor. The entrance to 4B appeared like any other, maybe slightly more discolored, the brass of the doorknob somewhat more tarnished. He knocked. The noise reverberated in the silent corridor, stark and without response. He knocked once more, with more force this time. Only quiet answered him. Adhering to procedure, he affixed a 24-hour notice of entry to the door. When he came back the following day and the notice was still present, undisturbed, he understood he was required to enter. With the building's universal key in his possession, he neared the lock. The key went in, but it would not turn. It was seized up completely. A locksmith had to be summoned, a man who muttered about the antiquity of the mechanism. With some lubricant and a bit of skilled manipulation, there was an abrasive, resonant snap. The sound of tumblers rotating for the first time since President Garrison was in the White House. Leo pressed on the door, and it creaked open with a faint groan, fracturing a crust of accumulated dust that had been untroubled for a generation. The initial impression was the air. It was not fetid or disagreeable. It was simply aged. It was the aroma of desiccated paper, arid textiles, and a delicate, long-since-faded air deodorizer. It was the scent of a sealed container. The apartment was dim, the substantial curtains pulled firmly shut. Leo searched for a light switch on the wall. He toggled it upward. No response. The power had been disconnected decades prior. Employing the flashlight on his mobile phone, he cast a beam of brilliant, contemporary light around the room, and the world seemed to freeze. Everything was enveloped in a fine, even coating of gray dust. It was not the lumpy, unsettled dust of a derelict area, but a delicate, unbroken blanket, akin to a gentle gray snow that had descended and never dissolved. It draped over a sofa with a botanical design, a wooden coffee table, and a large, rectangular television positioned in a particle board media console. The dust had blunted all contours and subdued every hue, transforming the whole room into a monochrome image of a forgotten instant. On the coffee table, a programming guide was open to the second week of October, 1983. Next to it was a mug containing a dark brown deposit at its base, the specter of a final cup of coffee. A copy of the Metropolis Chronicle was folded tidily, its headline, now barely discernible beneath the dust, reporting on events long relegated to history texts. This was not a tableau of disorder. It was the reverse. It was a tableau of uncanny, intentional arrangement. The periodicals on an end table were in a tidy pile, perfectly squared. The remote for the television, a cumbersome instrument linked by a lengthy cord, was situated exactly parallel to the side of the coffee table. On a set of shelves against the rear wall rested an Odyssey 3000, its signature joysticks poised on either side as if anticipating a game to commence. A small assortment of VHS cassettes was arranged beside it. The titles formed a guide to the blockbusters of the period: The Visitor from Space, Quest for the Sunstone, The Haunting Hour. It was evident that Edward Sterling was a person who prized orderliness. He was a person who returned items to their designated spots. This quiet, well-ordered scene rendered his abrupt, final disappearance all the more startling. It was as if he had simply dematerialized during a completely ordinary evening. He had not assembled a suitcase. He had not prepared for an extended absence. He had merely ceased. Advancing deeper into the apartment, Leo transitioned from the living area toward a compact galley kitchen. The floor was layered with faded canary-colored linoleum, now made matte by its 37-year-old film of dust. The appliances were artifacts from a different period of design. A refrigerator, in a shade of olive green that had once been the pinnacle of style, was enveloped in a profound, terminal quiet. Its door was held fast not by a lock, but by the solidified, ancient rubber of its seal. With a resolute tug, Leo broke the seal. He had braced himself for a dreadful smell, but there was none. The air that was released was merely cool and arid. Inside, an experiment in extreme mummification had taken place. A carton of milk had shriveled into a fragile, chalk-like shell. A section of cheese in plastic film had transformed into a dense, amber-hued stone. In the freezer, a line of home-style quick meals sat in their paperboard containers, their vibrant depictions of Salisbury steak and fried chicken offering a convenient dinner that was never consumed. On the worktop, a box of cereal Oreos stood beside a sealed glass container of Astrofizz. But the most revealing item was fastened to the wall beside the telephone. It was a promotional calendar from a neighborhood insurance broker. For the year 1983, every day of January, February, through all of September, had been marked off with a precise, black X. On the grid for October, the same systematic XS denoted the passage of time. The final X was on Tuesday, October 11th. Wednesday, October 12th was an immaculate, vacant square. This was the moment. This was the day that time came to a halt in apartment 4B. A door off the narrow hallway opened into the bedroom. If the living room represented the public persona of Edward Sterling, this was his private sanctuary. And it was here that the feeling of orderliness bordered on unsettling. The bed, draped with a plain brown coverlet, was made with immaculate precision. The corners were flawlessly tucked. The lone pillow was plumped and positioned in the center. Not a single crease was visible, apart from the gentle subsidence of the dust. It appeared as if he had awakened, completed his morning ablutions, and readied the room for his return in the evening. Within the closet, his existence was organized with the same exactitude. A line of suits, predominantly in traditional shades of gray and blue, was hung with perfect spacing. His shirts were categorized by color, a spectrum from white to light blue. On a shelf above, An assortment of sweaters was folded into flawless, identical rectangles. On the floor, a row of shoes, all recently shined, stood in formation. There were dress shoes, casual loafers, and a pair of athletic sneakers that seemed almost pristine. This was not the closet of a man in distress. It was not the closet of an individual planning a swift exit. It was the closet of a man who subscribed to structure, to routine, to the foreseeable cadence of his own existence. But it was the small, unassuming objects on the bedside table that truly caused Leo to pause. Beside a large, digital alarm clock that was inert with no numbers on its display, was a paperback novel, laid face down, as though its reader had just put it aside. The page was held open by the novel's own mass, a silent placeholder. And next to the novel, positioned neatly beside one another, were two items: Edward Sterling's wallet and his keys. Leo, using a pen from his own pocket to prevent disturbing anything, gently prodded the wallet open. Inside was Edward's driver's license, his visage a younger, unsmiling black and white image. There was approximately $40 in currency, a library card, and a few business cards. Next to it was a plain key fob with two keys. One for the apartment's main door, the other probably for his vehicle. This finding altered the entire situation. The narrative that had started to take shape in Leo's thoughts, of a man who chose to depart and begin a different life, abruptly disintegrated. One might leave a coffee cup. One might leave the television active. But one does not exit the front door to commence a new life and abandon one's wallet and keys. He had not simply exited the building. The proof indicated he had not even reached the door. He had disappeared from somewhere between making his bed and taking the very things he would require to meet the day. The significance of that finding, the wallet and the keys, permeated the dusty atmosphere. It was the central point of the entire narrative. A man getting ready to depart takes those objects. They represent the fundamental instruments for engaging with the world beyond one's home. To discover them left on a bedside table is to find a narrative that has been brutally severed, the latter half of the sentence never articulated. It implies a departure that was not only unforeseen but also immediate and not of his own volition. He was present one instant and absent the next. Leo resumed his grave inspection, heading toward the final unopened door, which led to the bathroom. Here, the impression of a morning routine suddenly interrupted was even more palpable. The room was compact, with antiquated blue and white tiles. On the rim of the sink, a toothbrush was situated in a ceramic container, its bristles desiccated but with the faint, powdery trace of toothpaste. Beside it, a can of AeroShave shaving cream and a safety razor were positioned on a small, rust-hued mark on the porcelain, a specter of water that had evaporated 37 years prior. He opened the mirrored vanity cabinet. The sound of the magnetic closure was sharp in the stillness. Inside was a collection of brands from 1983, a bottle of Dragon Fist aftershave, a stick of Rapid Glide deodorant, a bottle of aspirin. Everything was organized tidily, with nothing amiss. It was another component of the puzzle that did not align. If something had befallen Edward in the apartment, one would anticipate indications of a confrontation, of disarray. An overturned lamp, a disordered room. But there was nothing. The tableau was flawlessly, frighteningly ordinary. It was the immaculate state of the apartment that was so highly unusual. Returning to the living area, Leo's focus was now on the particulars that might reveal more about the man himself, not merely his customs. Who was Edward Sterling when he was not being a fastidious accountant? A small bookcase beside the inactive television provided some hints. The assortment was varied. There were multiple classic science fiction novels by authors such as Orson Hayes and Julian Croft. Beside them were scholarly history volumes about ancient Rome and the American Civil War. And then, a collection of paperback thrillers, spy novels by Marcus Kane and Simon Green. It was the collection of an inquisitive intellect, one that enjoyed escaping into realms of logic, history, and suspense. Hidden at the extremity of the shelf was a record player. It was a basic turntable, its plastic cover so coated with grime it was nearly opaque. Leo raised the cover, disclosing a record already on the platter. It was a classical recording, Bach's Brandenburg Concertos. It seemed to match the image of the quiet, methodical accountant. But as he examined the small assortment of vinyl records kept in a crate on the floor, a different aspect of Edward came to light. Alongside more classical compositions were albums by Transistor, the German trailblazers of electronic music, and Ethereum's ambient classic, Music for Airports. This was not solely the music of a reserved man. It was the music of a man intrigued by structure, by patterns, but also by what was to come, by new and developing sonic landscapes. The last element of this preliminary survey was a small wooden desk situated in a corner of the living room. This was evidently Edward's personal nexus of operations. A cumbersome 10-digit calculator was placed next to a cup containing meticulously sharpened pencils. A large ledger was open. The columns were inscribed with minute-perfect figures, a documentation of his private finances. Everything was tallied, down to the last cent. But it was a group of papers secured by a binder clip that held the most crucial clue since the wallet and keys. They were bank statements from the Sterling National Bank, spanning from 1981 to 1983. Leo cautiously examined them. They narrated a tale of financial prudence. Each month, a segment of Edward's salary was deposited. Each month, a check was issued to the building management for rent, long before he had prepaid the entire sum. His expenditures were modest. Small checks for utilities, food, the infrequent bookstore visit. It was the portrait of a man saving assiduously, living comfortably within his financial limits. Until the final statement, the one for September of 1983. It displayed all the typical transactions, but with one stark deviation. On September 28th, merely 2 weeks before he vanished, there was a solitary huge deposit.
$52,000.
In 1983, that was a substantial sum. It exceeded his yearly income. There was no notation, no clue as to its origin. It was simply a figure, a massive, unexplained irregularity in an otherwise completely foreseeable financial existence. The puzzle of Edward Sterling's fate was no longer solely about his whereabouts. It was now entwined with a clandestine fortune he had suddenly obtained just before he disappeared. The $50,000 enigma. How did a common accountant in 1983 acquire that sum of money? It was an amount that could alter a life. It could purchase a home, launch a company, or finance a new persona. It was also the type of money that could draw undesirable notice. This one-line item in a dusty bank statement converted the story from a straightforward, somber case of a missing person into a potential thriller, reminiscent of the plots in the spy novels on his shelf. Leo carefully returned the bank statements to the desk, his thoughts racing. He was obligated to report this. The police had to be brought back into the matter. A 37-year-old inactive case was suddenly, indisputably active. But before departing, he felt a duty to finish his inspection of the apartment. He had observed the common areas, the bedroom, the bathroom. He had seen Edward's financial records and his preferences in music and books. But was there anything more intimate? Anything that suggested family, friends, a life connected to other people? He started to search more methodically for photographs. In a dwelling so full of order, there were remarkably few. There were no cheerful family pictures on the walls, no snapshots placed in frames. It was as though Edward was a man devoid of a past, or one who opted not to show it. At last, in the lowest drawer of the desk, under a pile of old tax documents, he discovered a small, unadorned cardboard box. He removed the lid. Inside was not an assortment of mementos, but a compact, organized collection. There were just 3 photographs. The first was an old black and white image of a man and a woman, likely his parents, posed rigidly before a small, humble house. They were not smiling. The second was a high school yearbook picture of a young Edward, his features still developing, his demeanor serious even at that age. And the third was distinctive. It was a discolored color picture, a spontaneous shot. Edward was in it, but he was younger, possibly in his late 20s. He was seated at a picnic table and he was laughing. It was a sincere, uninhibited laugh, a type of expression completely missing from his other pictures. Beside him, A young woman with long dark hair was smiling at him, her hand resting gently on his arm. On the reverse of the photograph, a single word was written in tidy, flowing script: Clara. Alongside the photos was a small cluster of letters, fastened with a plain piece of string. They were from Clara. Leo did not read them all, feeling it was too much of an intrusion, but he noted the dates. They were from the early 1970s, a full decade prior to his disappearance. The greetings were warm, loving. They mentioned shared inside jokes, films they had seen, aspirations for the future. And then, in the final letter of the bundle, the tone shifted. It was more proper, more detached. It spoke of separate journeys, of hard decisions. It was a farewell letter. This small box provided the sole insight into a more profound emotional existence. A life that had once contained affection and merriment, and subsequently, deep sorrow. It created an image of a man who, following a major heartbreak, might have withdrawn into a reality he could manage. A reality of order, of books, of quiet routines. A reality where feelings could be neatly put away, just as his financial documents were. His meticulous nature was not merely a personality characteristic. It was a defense mechanism, a bastion he had constructed around himself. Now all the elements were present. A quiet, orderly man, a past sorrow, a sudden, mysterious influx of money, and a disappearance so abrupt that he abandoned his keys and wallet. The hypotheses started to multiply. Did his former love, Clara, suddenly return? Did the money originate from her, as a settlement or an inheritance? Or was the origin of the money far more malevolent? Could Edward, the quiet accountant, have discovered something at his workplace? Financial discrepancies, a secret ledger, a crime he was not supposed to witness. In his world of figures, he would have been in a prime position to detect an irregularity. Perhaps he attempted to act honorably, or perhaps he tried to use his finding for his own advantage, resulting in the $50,000 deposit. This was no longer just about conserving a time capsule. The apartment had transformed into a crime scene, frozen for 37 years. Every item was a piece of evidence. The dust was proof. The silence was a witness. Leo took out his phone, stepped back into the corridor, and pulled the door to apartment 4B closed. The sound of the latch echoed once more, but this time it felt different. It was not locking a memory away. It was safeguarding a mystery for the authorities who were about to show up, in the hope of finally providing an answer to the question that had hung in the air since October 12, 1983. What happened to Edward Sterling?